Hi, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to this talk sponsored by the Sana Center. My name is Ryan Bailey. I'm an editor and researcher at the center, and today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Phillips. Sarah's associate professor in the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney and a non-resident fellow at the Sana Center. Her work in research draws from years of fieldwork in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, particularly Yemen and Somaliland. She's the author of two books on Yemen, Yemen's Democratic Experiment, and Yemen, The Politics of Permanent Crisis, still one of my favorite books on Yemen. So if you haven't read that one, please check it out. And today we're going to be talking about her newest book, When There Was No Aid, War and Peace in Somaliland, which is available now. Before I shoot it over to Sarah, just explain a few things for technicalities. We do have simultaneous interpretation to Arabic. If you would like to take advantage of that, there's a button at the bottom right of the Zoom screen, and the Arabic channel is the Japanese one. Sarah and I will both be speaking in English. But if anybody wants to ask a question in Arabic during the Q&A period, people can hear that question on the English channel. And in terms of Q&A, please feel free if you have any questions throughout the talk to put them in the chat channel, and we will go over those at the end. We will also allow people after Sarah's done speaking to just raise their hands and ask questions directly. And at that point, I will unmute you and you can introduce yourself and ask the question. I think that's everything. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Sarah.
All right, thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you to everyone at the Sana Center for making this happen. It's so good to see some familiar faces out there too. All right, so I'm going to talk today about the book that I published this year, When There Was No Aid, War and Peace in Somaliland. And this book, of course, takes Somaliland as its major example, but because this is a forum for Yemen watchers, I want to make sure that I try to emphasize the book's relevance to Yemen as well. And that relevance is primarily around the role of external intervention in processes of war and peace and development. So for all of the doubts that are widely raised about the effectiveness of international aid in advancing peace and development around the world, there's not many, I mean, you could even say there's not really any good examples of places in the global south that are even relatively untouched by international aid. But what I argue in this book is that Somaliland's early years, so I'm talking roughly the period between 1991 and 2001, so its first decade or so, offers us a rare example of what this can look like. And I think the case of Somaliland allows us to ask what I think is really crisp comparative question that has some fairly sweeping implications for the study of post-conflict reconstruction. And that question is, why did the war in Somaliland end but continue in the rest of Somalia? Now, I'll give you the spoiler up front. Basically, I argue that the reasons that Somaliland's war ended while the rest of Somalia's didn't mostly stem in one way or another from the fact that Somaliland's lack of sovereign recognition meant that all of the usual suspects in international stabilization and peace-building efforts basically ignored it, meaning that it didn't have to contend with external actors who were working to either end its war or with international external actors who were working to benefit from its war. And I suspect that that point will probably already spark the attention of Yemen watchers. So I'm going to argue that Somaliland's experience of overcoming civil war contains some pretty powerful lessons for the international community working in conflict-affected states, including Yemen, of course, along the lines of less is more. And I think there are three lessons that are most important that we can take out of the book that I'm going to sort of apply to Yemen a little bit, but I am going to be focusing on the content of the book. I'll just run you through the three now, and I'm going to come back to them in more detail shortly. So the first one is just surrounding the large amount of time and political space that was available for the process to occur. The second one is that it was almost entirely locally funded. And the third one is that it wasn't really the state or even its clan institutions. I'm arguing it wasn't really institutions at all that has helped or that has done some of the really important heavy lifting in maintaining peace since the end of the war. And in fact, I think that you can even argue that institutional weakness can offer a source of strength. So throughout this session today, I'm going to suggest that Somaliland's experience of conflict resolution basically challenges one of the most ingrained presumptions about violence and poverty in the global South, and that is that external intervention is self-evidently useful in ending them. And I think that if we unsettle the assumption about international intervention indeed always being inevitably useful in ending civil wars in the global South. And I think Yemen's war and its peace process starts to look quite different. So let me refocus then on Somaliland. So I've got a little bit that I'm going to be sort of moving a bit between Somaliland and Yemen, but let me focus here on Somaliland. And there's a bit of background that I think we need before progressing any further. So Somaliland claimed independence from the rest of Somalia in 1991. Its sovereignty has never been recognized by any other state formally. It had an intermittent civil war between 1991 and 1996, and at times the violence that was experienced across Somaliland, which is sort of the northwestern part of Somalia, at times the violence there was even worse than that was experienced in and around Mogadishu. But because it had no sovereign recognition, this also meant that it has had negligible access to things like official development assistance, which is the form of aid that gets counted officially by the OECD. It also can't apply for IMF or World Bank loans, and it hasn't traditionally been eligible for strategic or resource rents, but this is changing now. In addition to this, though, the fact that it hasn't got sovereign recognition has meant that it doesn't carry international debts that it needs to service. It doesn't have any external requirements to put austerity measures into place either, or any of the other sort of standard neoliberal conditionalities that usually get imposed as part of a poverty reduction strategy. It's also subject to Somalia's arms embargo. So there is no legal weapons trade to Somaliland. So it has no legal access to weapons from the international weapons market. So together, this has meant that Somaliland, at least in its early days, particularly its its first 10 years, Somaliland was basically overlooked by international donors, international lenders, and development agencies. But it was also really crucially peripheral to the interests of the foreign militaries that were so active in Somalia in the 1990s. Their focus was very firmly on and around the capital of Mogadishu, where together the United States and the United Nations spent probably around about $4 billion combined on military operations and peacebuilding processes. International agencies also provided billions of dollars worth of food aid to help counter the famine that was devastating parts of southern Somalia. And the diversion of this aid became the linchpin of an entrenched conflict economy, all of which I'm sure, again, sounds quite familiar to Yemen watchers. There have been at least 18, though I lose count, so around 18, at least 18, internationally sponsored sets of peace talks that have been aimed at achieving national reconciliation in Somalia. Many of these have cost many millions of dollars and have involved large numbers of delegates. One of these conferences in Kenya continued for over 2 years and was only brought to a close once the Kenyan authorities reportedly held a so-called farewell party as a way of basically suggesting that it was time for Somalia's delegates to leave the country and go back to Somalia. On the other hand, though, and with the exception of only around $100,000, which was provided by 2 Western donors, one Swedish, one American, to support Somaliland's Baltimore Peace Conference in 1993, there was basically no external funding for any of the conference's that were held in Somaliland between 1991 and 1997, and that was so fundamental to negotiating the peace process. The money for this really didn't come from any other external source other than from members of the Somaliland diaspora. So Somaliland's peace and reconstruction phase really doesn't conform to international best practices, if you like, in either state building or development interventions. And I said I was going to focus on three specific points that I think are most applicable to the Yemeni War and its very internationalized peace process. So let me just go into a little bit more detail before I really dive in. So the first one being that in Somaliland, there was sufficient time and there was sufficient political space available for the mediation process to unfold. It took a long time. It took years. It took place over dozens and dozens of clan-based conferences, and it was really bumpy. Also, importantly, there was no expectation that there was going to be any particular institutional endpoint reached at the conclusion of all of this. So what I mean by that is they didn't have to hold national elections by a certain date. They didn't have to draft a constitution by a certain date. They didn't have to elect a president by a certain date. And all of the delegates that took part in this were locally selected. The second one, which I'm going to go back into, is that, as I mentioned, the process was almost entirely locally funded, but it was quite collusively so. We're not talking here about great grassroots economic inclusion. This was very much a matter of finances being held in the hands of the existing economic elite. So Somaliland's isolation also supported a really strong level of mutual dependence, though, between its political elites and its economic elites, because its belligerents couldn't just go outside to find political, economic, or military support. So this meant that there was a really clear incentive for the political elites of the day to nurture the economy and those producing wealth within the country rather than to prey on them. This is sometimes cited in the literature on political economy as being a really important point for what it is, one of the determinants of whether a country's political economy turns to rent seeking and predation. And the fact that you aren't able to go outside for this wealth is one of the strong factors that gets pointed to in that. And the third one is that Somaliland's institutions were quite weak. But I think that counterintuitively, this served as something of a source of strength for the country going forward. Okay, so let's drill down in detail to the issue of time and political space. So unlike many of the places that are targeted by international peace or state building initiatives, the political settlement that ended the violence in Somaliland evolved without explicitly externally driven expectations, without schedules, and without technical indicators of success. Now, a couple of authors, Farah and Lewis, provide what I think is a really striking explanation of one of the most important peace conferences, the one that I referred to before in Baltimore in 1993. And I think that this one might again resonate with Yemen watchers, and also I just like it. And they write, the Baltimore Conference was set to start in January, but was delayed until February. To discredit the government, which was against it, the elders declared it open on February 24th with virtually no preparation. And it was opened with 7 days devoted to reciting the Quran, so as to give time to effect arrangements. The actual business started on March the 3rd. So in other words, the Baltimore Conference was basically allowed to take as long as it needed to take, and take as winding or meandering a process as necessary in order to get there. Now, the UN brokered conferences that were held during the height of Somalia's violence in the 1990s, on the other hand, were really quite hasty affairs, with each lasting well under a fortnight, some of them just for a day or two. I think it's worth comparing this to the 2012 UN-led roadmap for Somalia, which I think is really quite exemplary of the so-called cookie cutter approach that still prevails in contemporary peace and state building exercises, even though the rhetoric is very much about how we have overcome this cookie cutter approach and we've moved away from it. It's still quite prevalent. So as the transitional federal government, that is the TFG, was preparing to hand over to the new federal government of Somalia in 2012, the UN Political Office for Somalia sets out this timetable in which, I mean, the participants could scarcely have time to have drawn breath, as they were supposed to race into establishing a new institutional framework for the country. The roadmap that was put on the table by the UN Political Office for Somalia required, and I'm going to quote Ken Menkhaus here because he puts it really nicely. He says that it required Somali stakeholders to finalize a provisional constitution by April 2012, to create a 1,000 person national constituent assembly by May 2012, a month later, hold a vote by the Constituent Assembly on the provisional constitution by May 22, so 22 days later, to select a 225 person parliament by June 15, and have the new parliament elect a speaker by July 20 and a president by August 20. Like, I am quite breathless just reading this, but there is more. Because once this was to be achieved, once this had been achieved rather, the president was going to be required to establish a new government that was going to run the country for 4 years, after which a full election could be held. So in other words, this roadmap that was put on the table set out to achieve in 5 months what the previous government hadn't been able to do in 7 years. And so many Somalis feared, rightly, it would seem, that the arbitrary and very hasty timing was pretty likely to sacrifice the new government's chance to gain popular legitimacy. And again, I suspect that the similarities here, some of the similarities at least, are quite clear to Yemen watchers. The inter-clan conferences that took place in Somaliland, on the other hand, between 1991 and 97, were the most important forums in which local elites negotiated the rules of the game that underpinned this emerging settlement. And it was here that the frameworks for national security, for political representation, and the constitution were largely established. The rules consolidated during this time established that the maintenance of, or the building and the maintenance of peace should be politically inclusive. It should be widely understood, use widely understood mediation techniques. It should maintain a balance of power between the clans and sub-clans, and it should not rely on outsiders to solve Somaliland's problems. These were quite clear agreements that were well understood as this process was carried out. And as I said, it was very bumpy. But what stands out to me in this is that there was a really distinct lack of reference to specific milestones, including, as I've said, timetables for elections or constitutional drafts, or other ways of trying to measure progress along the way, which of course is crucial for donors to be able to demonstrate that, for development agencies to demonstrate to donors that they've been using the money that they've been granted in an efficient way. So instead, what happened was the conferences drew on, as I've said, existing rules and norms. And this included just the concept of informality. That's a big overarching one. Another one is the idea of consensus over majority voting, which I suspect probably is familiar to many who watch Yemen. The idea or the importance of customary law and customary mediation processes. The idea that clans ought to be proportionally represented. So political authority ought to be based on the numbers that the clans had. And also something called halay dalay, which I may be mispronouncing, but it is forgiving injustices of the past where the losses that have been incurred are just too vast, too complex, too catastrophic to be able to calculate blood repayments. And the final one was the idea that each clan should maintain considerable autonomy within and responsibility for events occurring within its territory. So that's time and political space. Let's look then at the funding for it, because this is also a really important aspect to the peace process. So local communities in this were overwhelmingly responsible for funding the clan peace process. And this constituted a really massive financial burden for the hosts of these conferences. To give you an example, the 93 Baltimore Conference that I've referred to a few times here, and which was the most significant, the largest conference of any of them. It required the hosts, who were from the Gadabursi clan, to provide food and shelter for about 2,000 participants over a 5-month period. So the participants were very keenly aware that they were placing quite an imposition on their hosts, and as a result, that reciprocation was likely to be expected of them. The local funding of the conference also helped to remind everyone that time really shouldn't be wasted. This is a scarce resource scarce resources that were being put towards this. So decisions that were taken at the Baltimore Conference were almost always taken on the basis of consensus being reached between the parties rather than as the result of a majority vote. And this was really time consuming, but it was felt by participants that consensus was more likely to achieve a legitimate and a durable result. So when you got these intractable issues arising, as they so often would, parties would be given deadlines, sometimes issued the deadline again and again and again, so that the agreement that came out of this would be acceptable to everyone, rather than just putting the issue to the vote. And one of the elders that was present at the time reportedly explained this as basically the idea that voting was fighting, that if they were voting, they were laying the foundation for this to come to blows later. And the consensus was really the only way to move this forward. So what you would find is that the people who were chairing these meetings would quite often fall ill when there was an important agreement that was remaining out of reach for people. And this would allow more time for discussion and presumably more time for a face-saving outcome to be picked up. This means then that Somalilanders weren't under pressure to adhere to any kind of specific institutional endpoint, particularly those that are associated with liberal democracy, with good governance, or with international best practices. Instead, they had the freedom to cherry pick from local and international institutional models and to experiment with what was likely to work in the local context. And if it didn't work, they would try something else. They weren't being tied down to any particular way of doing this. As a result, participants' incentives to find solutions were overwhelmingly internal. And so they were really quite immediate. They weren't being done as responses to external pressure, as was the case elsewhere in Somalia, and of course, as now is quite often the case in Yemen. I might skip along a little bit here because some of the details of the economic collusion within the peace process can get into some fairly detailed local politics that may be of less interest to a Yemen group, but I'm happy to get into it in the Q&A if there's interest. But the basic point is that the president in the early to mid-90s, that is President Egal, combined these quite collusive business deals with security dividends for the wider population. So he sort of tethered the commanding heights of the economy to his own peace and state building project. And so the country's emergence from civil conflict was really quite out of step with the conventional international programs that emphasize grassroots economic inclusion. But it was also colored by struggles to control the means of legitimate coercion and by economic collusion between the president and the most wealthy merchants in the country. So this level of collusion helped to consolidate the economy in the hands of relatively few people, which is something that still exists today and is widely complained of. But it was seen at the time as being legitimate. So President Egal used a lot of the money that he was able to get in this way to disband the militias, to buy them off essentially, and to help them to buy back weapons and to form them into like a nascent national army and a nascent police force. So this was seen as being a legitimate way of going about things at the time, even if it has led to exclusive economic power and monopolies now. I think people still generally reflect on its historical legitimacy. So for a long time, I thought that that's basically where the book story was going to end, right? That external intervention inhibits contextually important people, inhibits contextually important processes from being able to emerge, and that the overriding presumption that intervention is a valuable thing for external actors to provide is quite limiting to processes of development or conflict resolution. And that certainly is a thread that runs through the book and that I've taken you through up until this point. But then I realized that there was something that had really been staring me in the face throughout writing this book. And that's not it. There was more to it than this. That this is a story about a lot more than just the importance of allowing local context to determine the peace building and development process. Because what I think that Somaliland's experience helps us to see is that many of the things that development and security scholars and practitioners have so long presumed to be the case about the way that peace and political order emerges and endures are fundamentally wrong. This includes me in some of my previous work as well, to be fair and put that on the table. And I think this is because we prioritize institutional strength. We look at whether formal or informal institutions have the capacity to enforce the laws, basically. And so we tend to see them as being almost the inevitable cornerstone of political order. So we typically hear the response to civil war or to terrorism or to large-scale criminality as being about the need to build up the state. So to increase the capacity of state institutions to provide a robust security guarantee and to set and enforce rules. But this brings me to the third point that I've been foreshadowing, which is about institutional weakness, also possibly providing a source of strength and political order. And this point is a bit trickier than the first two, but I think that the parallels to Yemen are also important here as well. So one of the things that my interviews in Somaliland over a number of years really underlined for me was that the precarity of Somaliland's peace was, and I think still is, harnessed as a way of sustaining it. And I think that this point is quite easily missed by people watching the process unfold through lenses that are trained to focus on the emergence of effective state or state-like institutions. Somalilanders knew that it wasn't their formal institutions, by which I mean things like their parliament, their bureaucratic apparatus, their police force, etc. It wasn't these formal institutions that was truly preventing a resurgence in organized large-scale violence. It wasn't them that was really able to provide that security guarantee. But neither was it their informal institutions, like their clan structures and their norms, because people are quite well aware that just as these informal institutions, these clan-based institutions, just as they can be mobilized for peace, they can also be mobilized for war. And so this is where I think I deviate from the rest of the literature on Somaliland, which tends to credit either the state apparatus that was formed in large part during these clan-based conferences that I've been talking to you about in the early to mid-90s, or the clan, or Somaliland's so-called hybrid system, by which I mean this sort of fruitful combination of the clan and formal organizations into something that is a bit of both. Instead, what I think was doing a lot of the work at this time, and still is, was this deep understanding of their own precarity and of the ease that the situation in Somaliland could conceivably, quite conceivably, become like Mogadishu's again. Because over and over again, people were comparing the peace in Somaliland to the real and the imagined violence in the rest of Somalia. And I remember that in one of my trips, I had person after person kind of tell me, oh, if you want to understand peace and stability and security in Somaliland, you have to go and see the gold merchants. And so after quite a number of people told me to go and do this, I did. And the gold merchants are a group of women, sort of middle-aged and above, who sit on one of the main streets in Hargeisa selling large quantities of gold with no visible form of security. And when I arrived, they sort of started shouting at me, basically, look, take photographs of this. You go show people that this is peace and security in Somaliland. So they were quite clear about what the story that I was probably looking for and the thing that I was probably trying to understand by coming to see them. But to me, what really struck me was that there was this implicit subtext to that story. And that is that things were actually not very different, were actually very different not very long ago. So I had this sense that war and peace were quite intermingled and that each were being understood through the proximity to the other, by which I mean being understood through the ease with which one becomes the other, and the way that the fear of war was being kept so immediate by the ongoing violence in the south of Somalia, and that this was actually forming an integral part of the maintenance of peace in Somalia, in Somaliland rather. Somalilanders have got a very historically grounded fear about the velocity of war, the speed with which war can take over everything. They've also got a very historically grounded understanding of the irrelevance of international actors to containing the spread of violence, to containing the spread of war. And this seems to get foregrounded, such that in times of crisis where they've had very close elections and other political contexts, the ideas about mobilizing for political violence seems to get almost bracketed out as being not a viable or even not really a logical course of action. So in a sense, it's this the ability to sustain peace has not been, I think, so much despite the fragility of its institutions, but kind of also because of them, and because people know that they are precarious and fragile, and because people are quite aware that they can't necessarily rely on these institutions, whether state-based or clan-based or something in the middle, to extinguish a violent spark once it's been lit. And as a result, the precarity of peace and the ease with which people believe that it could all come crashing down has been harnessed, I think, into this widespread understanding that political violence is just not worth the risk. Now, I don't mean this in a rational choice kind of a way where people are rationally calculating what the risks and opportunities of violence are. I don't think that's the way that it works, but in a more subtle and discursive way where violence doesn't really present itself as being an option to be rationally assessed, because it's kind of seen as being just an illogical thing to choose. And I think that this understanding, or even this this appreciation of precarity, is very much a part of what underpins tribal conflict resolution mechanisms in Yemen as well, albeit in a bit of a different way. So let me talk about that for a second before I wrap up. As someone who has trained as a political scientist, I've really learned to turn to anthropologists when it comes to trying to answer the real questions about violence and its resolution. They seem to have much more interesting approaches to it. Sheila Weir, an anthropologist who writes on Yemen, she may be known to some of you. She writes that conflicts in Yemen are choreographed to ensure the maximum attention with the minimum of harm. And this really resonates with me because I've witnessed this, and as I'm sure many of you have, on a number of occasions in Yemen. The goal is typically to make a big scene, to shoot, but ideally not to injure people by aiming too far off or by aiming too close. You aim off the mark. And as a result, the level of firepower is often, though not always, of course. And here I am speaking of a time before the recent war, which is not so far back in history. But the level of firepower is often greater than the number of casualties that get caused by that firepower. And I think that this tends to lay this foundation for theatrical brinksmanship, in which the cost of miscalculation is, of course, very real and very high. But it also means that violent outbursts tend to be relatively short-lived, because the symbolic aspect of the performance is also really important and well understood. Now, of course, there's a kicker to this, and that is that symbolic violence is incredibly delicate. It is highly susceptible to miscalculation or just mistakes. But I think that's the point of deploying it as well. I think it's like the delicacy of symbolic violence that gives it its potency. So what I'm getting at here is that by drawing this brief comparison between some Yemeni understandings or some understandings of violence between Somaliland and Yemen, is that we miss some really significant things when we assume that state or clan institutions bear the primary responsibility for providing a reliable mechanism against violence. It is far more contextual than that. It's based on people's historical understandings of the role that violence plays. It's based on cultural understandings of the role that violence and the state plays in providing political order. So we shouldn't just assume that state institutions inevitably reduce violence, because I think that the case of Somaliland demonstrates that in fact weaker institutions can do this too. If we look then at the case of, if we shift again to Yemen, I think that we can see that while that one of the most striking commonalities, I think, across Yemen's modern wars is that their length and their lethality has depended substantially on the degree to which outsiders have become involved in them. Yemen's endogenous wars have been much shorter affairs. It's, of course, had its share of nasty, sometimes dreadful conflicts, but it's when outside forces have intervened that they've become intractable. I'm thinking, of course, of 1962 and of the current war. And I think that this acknowledgement that Yemeni wars tend to be a lot longer when external actors become deeply involved should be a starting point when thinking about the kinds of political space that might help to facilitate an end to the current war. So to conclude all of this, I would say that Somaliland's experience suggests that if donors, external actors, peace builders want to engage more effectively in post-conflict or developing contexts, they need, as a very first step, to take a longer-term view of political transformation as something that occurs over years, even over decades, that occurs in fits and starts rather than in accordance with roadmaps, with milestones, short-term planning cycles, or predefined outcomes. The problem is that this requires a move away from the expectation that the benefits are going to be visible within the time frame of the donor's current funding cycle or during the tenure of current members of staff, or that they're necessarily going to adhere to external expectations of what form these institutions should take. So here we get to a really fundamental dilemma. And that is that the fluidity that I've been talking about, the indeterminacy, the precarity that I think are inherent to the establishment of durable political arrangements may be quite incompatible with the structural requirements of external agencies to appear to be able to steer, to be able to measure, and to be able to provide tangible evidence of progress to justify their further funding. So at issue, we've got a couple of questions of control that I'm going to end with. One of which is, are external actors willing to critically examine whether their need to be seen to control outcomes so as they can maintain their funding cycles, whether this need is compatible with their stated objectives of facilitating peace and facilitating development? Second to that, are they able to step back from seeking that control if they are going to maintain their funding, if you find that these two things are compatible? So these are, I think, extremely difficult questions to ask because it puts the spotlight on the thorny issues of the other reasons that external actors get involved in peace processes in the Global South, including that this is what their organizational mandate requires them to do. And if they don't do it, then what do they exist for? For this reason, I think the idea of less being more may be more appealing on paper. We hear it talked about quite a lot, the need to pull back, to allow for local ownership. But in practice, I think this is actually a more radical proposition for these reasons of the structures within these agencies. I'll finish with that because I see that we've clicked over